Rome's dependence upon slaves has been well established in terms of economics and general society. Both during the times of the Republic, to the late Empire, agriculture, industry, domestic life, the state, entertainment, intellectual life, military, religion, sexual relations, all of these was based on the slavery system. Rome's dependency upon slavery to function and maintain its political, social, and economic stranglehold on the Mediterranean area and beyond, leads to some terrifying conclusions. Was the Rome a slave empire? In this video I will present you the whole history, functioning, and overall status of a slave, in order to answer this interesting question. The origins of slavery in Rome are unknown, but it was common in ancient societies to keep slaves. There are a few references to slavery before the 3rd century BC, and those speak of small-scale slavery. With military victories and expansion, slavery grew at an incredible rate. In 225 BC, there were an estimated 600,000 slaves in Roman Italy, but only 194 years later that number grew to approximately 2 million. As the numbers of slaves rose, so did the number of occupations in which slaves were used. Slavery was not primarily an issue of race or ethnicity, but some ethnicities were used more than others. There were 3 different social classes of freedom: the ingenuous, the libertinus, and the servus. A freeborn citizen could not rightfully be a slave, except through special commendation from the state. Slaves could own their own property, called a peculium, and could use it for 2 purposes: the purchase of a slave of their own and to purchase one's own freedom. Slaves had certain rights, but their status in Roman society was the lowest of the low. Society legally considered the slave little more than human tool, and masters were not required to mark their slaves in any way to distinguish them from the free people of Rome. Familial ties among slaves were an important aspect of slave life, and some married slaves were able to stay together despite the odds. In 325 AD, Constantine instructed an official in Sardinia not to split a slave. Varro suggests that farmers should reward foremen with mates from among their fellow slaves to bear them children, which is why slave families of Epirus have the best reputation and bring the highest price. Despite the large number of educated and skilled slaves coming in from abroad, some slaves had the opportunity for a limited education, mostly vocational. The master or his slaves usually did the training with an eye towards bringing a higher price at sale or for their own private use. Slaves came from a variety of sources, including the wars, kidnapping and shipping. Kidnapping was also a tool of the slave trader, as pirates captured a young Julius Caesar and ransomed him for 50 talents. Shipping also brought slaves from outside the Roman state, as well as from within the territory of Rome itself. Exposed children were also a source for slaves, as it was viewed as morally suspect. Slavery could also be a punishment for criminal activities, such as mine workers or gladiators. Debt could also lead to slavery, as the government gave a creditor the right to sell the debtor into slavery only if the debtor was unable to pay. Nearly any person in the ancient world could become a slave, and those who could prove their Roman citizenship had some recourse against their wrongful enslavement. Now, after we discussed these 3 important points about slavery, let's look closer on all of the places where we could find slaves in the Roman Empire. During the end of the Republic and beginning of the Empire, slaves on the farm could work a myriad of jobs, but none more important than the villicus. This slave steward, or overseer, was the manager of the entire farm. He was responsible for carrying out any and all of his master's orders, as well as keeping the slave workers busy and providing for their needs. He was responsible for collecting any outstanding loans and could not lend anything unless directed by his master. Top priorities for a villicus were keeping the farming equipment in good repair and keeping the slave clothing properly maintained. Masters often required that he always be present on the farm property to ensure that all the necessary work was finished. The villicus' ability to perform all the duties on the farm in the presence of his fellow slaves helped to keep his charges accountable in both the speed and quality of their work. He was the first to rise in the morning, and the last to go to sleep. The overseer should not be too lax or too cruel in punishing his charges, and should not consult with soothsayers or witches. The wife of the villicus had similar tasks and characteristics, though hers were confined to the domestic staff. Of course, there were other jobs in the agricultural field beside the villicus. Farm owners used a number of slaves as either laborers or other managerial staff. If the owner possessed more than one farm, he might employ a procurator to oversee all the different farms and report to the master. Manual labor slaves were divided into gangs, and the operam magistracy oversaw each gang. Gardeners kept the grounds around the villa clean and pruned in case of the master's arrival. Alongside the permanent slave staff, the villicus brought day laborers in at certain times of the year. The number of slaves on the farm could dictate the treatment of slaves on the farm. Roman agriculture was dependent on the slave workforce at the end of the Republic and beginning of the Empire. Slaves planted the crops and plowed the fields, supervised the work and kept the books, cooked, cleaned, and maintained the grounds. Free laborers occasionally at planting and harvesting times, but their efforts were only supplementary to the work of the slave. The use of slaves in trade between the 2nd century BC and the 2nd century AD was extensive, with 2 references to slaves as negotiators. Slaves were used to load and unload boats and in warehouses to move products. The most labor-intensive use of slaves was towing ships and barges. In the rest of industry, slaves fell into one of 2 categories, skilled or unskilled labor. Slaves did the majority of the work in most factories, and masters trained unskilled slaves in certain occupations advantageous to their master. In the 1st century BC, Marcus Licinius Crassus bought as many as 500 slaves in a period of 8 years and used them to rebuild buildings that he had built. The most important details are that some masters allowed their slaves to set up a business of their own, with the master investing a certain sum of money to start up the business. The slave would pay their owner a set amount of money every year, or only retain a percentage of the profits. A more generous master could just require a repayment of the initial capital invested. One long-term problem with industrial dependence on slavery was the lack of innovation, which stunted the growth of new products. Factories depended upon slaves to create the products they manufactured, markets depended upon slaves to work the shops, and even the massive importation of products was dependent upon the slave. Without the daily labor of slaves, Roman industry would have had a hard time functioning, much less making a profit. The domestic realm was the largest user of slaves during the end of the Republic and beginning of the Empire. Slaves were also common in the homes of the middle class and perhaps even some of the lower class. The treatment of domestic slaves often depended on the position the slave held, as slaves ran the gambit of domestic occupations and importance. All slaves were under the power of the master and his family, though often the matrona saw to the daily affairs of the house. The slave owner gave the procurator the power to manage business outside the home, the atriensis was the manager of the house, the dispensator controlled the supplies and their storage, and the sileniarius maintained the discipline of the slaves and kept the home quiet. The slave owner divided the rest of the slaves into groups in regards to their given tasks, with each slave usually performing only one specific function. Domestic slaves could hold any number of specialized jobs, such as front door watchmen, foot washers, hairdressers, pages, and litter bearers. There were also entertainers such as dancers, jesters, dwarfs, and even misshapen freaks. Households sometimes kept tutors, doctors, and readers. Cooks, dairymen, bakers, fire boys, pantry keepers, caterers, table wipers, carvers, and waiters helped fill out the kitchen and dining room staff. Cleaning staff included curtain hangers, sweepers, hall keepers, silver plate cleaners, and gold plate cleaners. There were even slaves whose only job was to attend the toilets in the house. In the early empire, the emperor created public services, such as the cura aquarum, which was dedicated to the preservation of the aqueduct system. After Marcus Agrippa died in 33 BC, Agrippa Jr. used his own slaves for this purpose and left these slaves to the people of Rome. In 22 BC, Augustus organized a professional fire department. At the beginning of the empire, the government started a flurry of public building projects, with as many as 50 slaves turning out bricks in each factory. Despite the fact that most of the workers were freemen, the building projects were still dependent on slave labor. Mining was a large employer of state slaves during the late Republic and early Empire. The workers themselves were slaves, and they had a low life expectancy due to hard work and poor conditions. Legislation in Rome aimed to keep the number of slave miners low in Italy, but slaves were vital to Rome's ability to mine vital minerals and metals. In the Republican government, slaves were used as clerks, cashiers, accountants, watchmen, heralds, lictors, beadles, janitors, etc. In the late Empire, eunuchs held a very powerful position. They could allow or withhold the right to see the emperor and accepted bribes from those seeking an audience. This power allowed them to affect policy depending on whom they allowed or did not allow to see the emperor. The state itself became dependent on the daily labor of slaves during the end of the Republic and beginning of the Empire. Slaves protected the city from fire, ran the jails and worked the mines, and supplied the labor that made the massive public building projects possible. Without slaves, the paper trail necessary for Roman government would have slowed or stopped altogether. Well, from this issue I will start the next part of this video. I hope you had a good time. This was History Revamped. To the next video.